Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day to be with us. So sincere thank you for that. Also want to thank the members of my hub team who've helped put this on. It's been a very busy week for them and want to thank them for making this happen for us. Our discussion today is going to focus on better understanding the types of risks that are around us with a deeper dive on one of the largest risks for benefit plan sponsors, drugs, which for most organizations make up to 60 to 70% of the medical plan spend. And with the emergence of certain high cost drugs, can really put the finances of your plan at considerable risk. But before I begin, I have a few housekeeping items. At the end of the presentation, we'll be holding a short Q&A. So if you have any questions during the presentation, please click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, type your question into the space provided, and we'll do our best to answer all your questions at the end of the session. This session is being recorded, so for anyone currently enrolled in the Witness Protection Program, it'd be best to shut your camera off now. After the webinar, you will receive a link to this recording to watch it again or to share with your colleagues. We will also send a link to a survey to provide feedback on the presentation itself. But before we get into the discussion, I thought I would make some quick introductions on our speakers. My name is Eric Kerr. I'm one of the senior leaders on the employee benefits team here at Hub International in Ontario. I also provide strategic support to our team in Atlantic Canada. I've been working in the Canadian group benefits space my entire career, this being my 24th year. I've had roles on both the insurance and consulting side. And while my current role is engaging with prospective clients on the ongoing management of their programs, a lot of the work I'm doing today is centered on harmonizations and consolidations or bringing the benefit plans of multiple groups together. I also do quite a few strategic reviews for clients who are looking for an opinion or even a second opinion on how to better manage their plans or better engage their employees, and often, which is most times the case, a combination of the both. Personally, I'm happily married to my high school sweetheart, Cheryl Ann, and I'm dad and hockey coach to my two sons, Connor and Oliver. Co-presenting with me today is Helen Stevenson. Helen is the founder and CEO of the Formulary Group, which is a healthcare company that built a proprietary evidence-based drug list called the Formulary. They also have an award-winning drug research tool called Drug Finder that provides Canadians with valuable comparative drug information. This tool saves money both for the employee and also for the company benefits programs themselves. Helen was the first full-time executive of Ontario's public drug programs. She's also the former Assistant Deputy Minister of Health for Ontario. Under Helen's leadership, the Ontario government achieved an unprecedented $1.5 billion savings over the 5-year period, and that's billion with a B. On a personal note, Helen has trained with the Navy SEALs and learned how to rappel down buildings with the Toronto SWAT team. So you can tell that Helen knows a bit about risk and certainly how to keep herself protected. And with a resume like that, I'm so glad I got to introduce myself first. Helen is an impressive individual who's a subject matter expert on drugs, and Hub is very fortunate to have access to the Reformulary Group and being able to partner with people like Helen and her team. As the benefits landscape continues to shift, your readiness to deal with risk, your awareness of evolving benefit plan risks, and your organization's tolerance for those risks are critical components of strong stewardship. On our agenda today, we will speak to the 3 types of risks. We will discuss awareness. This is where Helen will enlighten you on the ever-changing world of prescription drugs. Towards the end, we will review your tolerance to risk, which is really hard to know your tolerance unless you have a strong awareness. And finally, we'll discuss some next steps. There are many definitions of risk, but I like to simplify it by using a quote from Warren Buffett, who said, "Risk comes from not knowing what you are doing." So really the awareness piece is most critical to managing your risks. As I mentioned, managing risk is about being aware. Let's be honest, stuff happens, but it is your level of awareness that determines how quickly and certainly how effectively you can manage the situation and recover from it. There's always going to be those unknown unknowns, and we're living in one today. COVID-19 has been extremely disruptive to everyone, especially HR teams. But in conversations with clients and prospective clients, almost all unanimously admit that they are better positioned to manage a major catastrophic event because they're more aware of what could potentially happen in the future. So let's dig a little deeper here on the concept of risk. There are three categories. Each carries potential outcomes that can be detrimental to an organization and an organization's benefits sustainability, and could be a drain on other parts of your business. They are preventable risks, strategic risks, and external risks. Always have trouble with that first preventable one. So let's talk a little bit about preventable. These are internal and can be averted. Examples could be things like unethical or unauthorized employee actions. Having a high tolerance to preventable risks offers no strategic upside. So there's no advantage there. And over time can really erode a company's brand and value. So good rules-based systems and good internal policies like a code of conduct can help manage and prevent these types of risks. But not all risks are bad. High potential returns will often carry significantly more risk. And an organization does need to take calculated risks in order to grow their business and produce a reward. This is really related to the doing your homework principle, and I can hear my parents' voice ringing in my head as I say that. But to help with this, a robust risk management system can help reduce the chances of that type of risk event happening and enhance an organization's ability to contain the event should it occur. And lastly, the area that we're going to focus on today is external risks. These risks are generally beyond our control, and it's difficult to prevent these events from occurring. Leadership teams must consider their possibility in an effort to minimize their impact. This is why you have much of your corporate and personal assurance today. So really for areas that are outside of your influence and control. However, studies have shown that many organizations often overestimate their ability to influence external risks events that are heavily determined by chance. Effective risk management policies and processes can help counteract these biases. Readiness really asks, do you have a plan? One thing that I've learned in my journey with Hub is that our commercial teams deal mostly with the finance side of an organization, whereas our employee benefits is typically handled by human resources. I've also learned that in many organizations, the two groups do not always talk, or worse, don't interact at all. Finance teams are typically responsible for mitigating and protecting against financial risks, but often steer clear of the benefits programs. Why I think it might be because there's a lack of understanding of the potential risk elements themselves. To this day, I still find the seemingly lack of integration between these two teams somewhat baffling. So how aware are you? We have identified 6 elements of potential risks for your health and benefit plans. Each of these elements is an individual presentation on its own, especially the wonderfully exciting topics of premium rate and expense volatility and plan administrator liability. But our goal here today is to keep you awake and engaged. So we're going to limit your awareness to the 4 highlighted elements that we're showing here right now. And then we're going to have a deeper discussion on how these areas can be affected by prescription drug claims. So these areas are public healthcare policy, contract changes, stop loss, and carrier mobility. This is why we invited Helen. Helen is the expert on prescription drugs, and where I can, I'll try and help with some color commentary on why what she's saying might be important to you. So I'm going to pass this over to Helen to discuss the 4 elements of risk awareness with a focus on drugs. So Helen, over to you.
Thanks, Eric. First, I'd just like to share with everyone that I own and run a business. So all of what I'm going to talk about is actually also important to me as well. Further to Eric's introduction, I did spend 5 years in the Ontario government leading big reforms of the prescription drug system. 2 of those years were planning and bringing forward legislation and regulations, and then 3 years of implementation. We also managed to squeeze in another set of reforms as well. So I have an informed basis from which to discuss public policy and, as I say, the power of the pen. All could be considered as external risks, potentially beyond your control. So 3 different aspects I'm going to speak about: generic drug pricing, a regulatory body called the PMPRB, and national Pharmacare. So first, let me clarify a couple of terms that I'm going to use. So provincial plan means the drug plan that's funded by the province for specific groups of people. Here in Ontario, that's mostly people over 65. Private plans means a drug plan that's funded by an employer, association, union, for instance. And then I want to reiterate a third term as well, namely a formulary. So in its simplest form, a formulary is essentially the list of drugs that are covered by your plan. Every single drug plan has a formulary. It's just you may not know what's on its list. So first, let me talk about generic pricing. We, Ontario, followed by other provinces, really drove down generic prices. Our goal while I was in government was to help drive down prices for your plans, that is for your employer-sponsored benefit plans. I'd say we get a B+ for that work. Why? Because if the province doesn't fund a drug, then generic companies can pretty much charge whatever they want to private plans such as yours. So here's a real life example. Eye drops. So Atlantic Canada public plans pay for it, and it's about $10 a month. Other provincial plans, including Ontario, do not pay for it. Only private plans pay, and it's $26 per month. So same drug from same manufacturing dispensed by the same pharmacy. Why does that matter to you? Because unless your drug plan includes a well-managed formulary, or which I mentioned is a drug list, you're paying much more. Another one is the PMPRB, the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board. So new regulations were intended to drive down prices on brand name drugs and create some price consistency, such as the one I just mentioned, among public and private plans. It sounds really good. That said, it's created an intense ongoing tension between pharmaceutical companies and government. And the risk, according to pharmacy, is if those regulations go through, they may not bring new drugs to market in Canada. That could impact all of us. Next, National Pharmacare. There's really no consistent definition of what National Pharmacare could mean. Back in April of this year, the Liberal government passed a resolution related to the implementation of Pharmacare for all. As this slide outlines, there was then a private member's bill that was defeated several weeks before that. And most importantly, while it was referenced in the federal budget, there were no concrete steps with respect to Pharmacare included. So I'd suggest that means it's on the back burner for now. Where Pharmacare could benefit private plans is related to drugs for rare diseases. These tend to be very expensive drugs, sometimes with limited amount of clinical evidence due to the small number of people with rare diseases. And when I say expensive, expensive means hundreds of thousands of dollars for a couple of drugs, millions of dollars per person. Many, including myself, have been advocating for a national rare disease strategy and program led for and paid by the federal government. Certainly in my current role, there were families that would actually move to a different province to get better coverage for drugs for rare diseases. Depending on how the federal government defines Pharmacare, this could have a profound and complex impact on private plans. Next, contract changes and how carriers are coping. Over the last few years, carriers have coped with increasingly expensive drugs and drug plans through different contract changes. For example, Manulife introduced the Drug Watch in 2015. Drug Watch essentially monitors new drugs, and they may actually delay adding a new drug to the formulary. Canada Life introduced something called the SMART program back in 2017, similar types of program. And Sun Life recently introduced a drug risk management program, much after the others, which essentially, and then introduced the reference drug program, which is essentially a program that among different drugs, it only pays up to the price of the cost of one specific drug, which is called the reference drug. Members then pay out of pocket for any amount over that. Every single carrier has their own set of formularies. And in fact, drug plans have changed dramatically over the past 10 years. The choice of formulary is now extremely important. Formularies that provide open coverage, meaning they cover any drug, could essentially be thought of as a blank check. As a quick side note, we built and actively manage our own formulary called the Reformulary, as Eric mentioned, that private plans such as yourself subscribe to. We have an independent committee of medical experts that review the evidence for drugs, and we incorporate their advice into our list. We've been doing this since 2011, and it's proven to contribute to drug plan sustainability. We work very closely with hub advisors and can model your plan. So if you're interested, please contact your hub advisor. Stop loss. Plans are increasingly exposed. Over the past 5 years, we've seen more specialty drugs on the market and more expensive specialty drugs on the market. So more in terms of the number of them and more expensive ones. The impact on fully insured plans is typically managed through an industry pool. Some predict that as more and more expensive specialty drugs get approved for sale in Canada, this will result in more recurring claims to drug pools, which means the cost to provide this insurance will rise. For self-insured plans, on the other hand, there can be huge vulnerability to unexpected large claims. For instance, here's a real-world example of the impact of high-cost drugs on stop loss. This particular plan, which we've recently been involved with, there are about 45 members. The plan spend is $105,000, of which 64% or $67,000 is on one specialty drug for one member, and there's 2 cycles, meaning 2 treatment cycles. It has had a profound impact on the profound increase on the pooling charge. But what if the pooling charge, in theory, the pooling charge should come down after the second cycle of treatment when that drug is no longer, treatment is finished, but what if it doesn't? So the client in this particular case is actually putting the formulary in place for the balance of the drug spend to ensure that there's evidence-based criteria related to future specialty drug coverage, and the pooling charge at this point is still to be determined. Eric, do you want to jump in at this point?
Yeah, Helen, there's folks on the phone with various different roles. Some are not even related to benefits at all. So I wanted to clarify that stop loss is also known as healthcare pooling. It's like a risk policy under your healthcare plan. All plans would have a stop loss limit for companies of a smaller size. The most common would be $10,000 to $15,000 with the first dollar out of country. So this means that the most your plan would absorb in terms of health claims would be up to that threshold or attachment point, the $10,000 or $15,000 that I mentioned. Anything above that amount would be pooled or removed from your experience and spread across the insurance company's book of business. So in your example, Helen, the $105,000 drug spend with $67,000 for one drug would likely mean that $10,000 of that drug would be charged to the claims experience, so responsibility of the plan sponsor, and the balance of the $57,000 would be covered by the insurance company under their stop loss, their pooling limit. Now, if the drug is recurring every year, the insurance company will continue to pick up the $57,000 annually, but of course, will adjust the increase to the plan premiums to cover the new expected risk. So I just wanted to make that clarification. So thanks, Helen.
Thanks. So I've been talking about more specialty drugs on the market and more expensive specialty drugs on the market. The next several slides include data about drugs and projected drug costs. So please bear with me as I take you through these slides. This particular slide. So we have a database of prescription claims data for about 35% of the Canadian population. That includes people covered through government plans, public plans, and people covered through private plans such as yours. We mine the data to understand the use and cost of certain drugs and groups of drugs, and also to understand how people switch from one drug to another or add on additional drugs, for instance. This particular slide shows the top drugs by spend from 2013 to 2020. Some of you may have heard of a class of drugs called biologics. So these are drugs such as Remicade, Humira, and others that treat conditions such as rheumatoid arthritis, Crohn's disease, among others. You'll see from this chart that biologics have consistently been in the top 3 or 4 in terms of drug spend across the country. Many of these drugs cost between $30,000 and $60,000 per member. By any measure, these drugs are expensive, and they will most likely impact your stop loss. This next slide now shows those same, but by medical conditions. So the medical conditions for the drugs on the previous slide. Biologics, as I mentioned, treat multiple indications, which is why this slide says biologic. Of particular note, though, it isn't just expensive biologic drugs that are driving up spend in your plans. It's also increasing use of drugs to treat asthma, heart and blood pressure, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. And I'm going to show you some numbers on the next slide to show that. So take the drug Vyvanse, a drug to treat ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It has become a fairly commonly prescribed drug among children. Some physicians would certainly argue that it's overprescribed. The chart to the left is the top drug spend in 2019, and the chart to the right is the top drug spend in 2020. The graph or the chart there in below shows the increase in cost per claimant for this particular drug from 2019 to 2020. So from $636 to $688 for the exact same drug. So that's an 8% increase across a large number of claimants taking Vyvanse. The result, you'll see there in red, the spend on Vyvanse increased from 1.06% in 2019 to 1.35% in 2020, and the number of claimants increased from 0.93% to 1.32%. So Eric, you'll likely want to comment here.
Yeah, I guess you can see me chomping at the bit here. So oftentimes, and in consultation, when you and I have chatted, Helen, existing drugs are reformulated to create new drugs to treat already existing condition. And oftentimes without any material additional benefit, they do so, albeit at a higher cost. And I think you made the point earlier, but if you have an open-ended formulary or list, and the doctor decides to prescribe that newest drug, it could significantly increase the drug spend, and as a result, the premium rates and her claims expenses. So it's not just these high-cost drugs. I'd be mindful of all the drugs that are coming through the program. Drug inflation has remained relatively flat over the past few years, with an influx of generic drugs and things coming off patent, but that can change. But Helen, the last time that you and I talked, we talked a little bit about, how long a drug has a patent for. And I do get that question a lot from my clients. I'm wondering if you maybe could just explain how long that patent process is for Canada.
Yeah. So, a drug, when they file the patent, that's when the protection essentially starts. So, typically that's a 20-year process, but effectively, by the time the drug comes on the market, they could have anywhere between, 7, 8, 9 years of patent protection. It depends, sometimes the generic companies, for instance, use litigation as a way to try to challenge the patents. So we sometimes see drugs coming on the market early. Yeah. So this slide, I'm going to take you through a few slides now with some drugs, as I say, drugs to watch. Specifically because these are drugs that could materially affect your plans, including future pooling and or stop loss rates. So these two drugs are to treat a condition called cystic fibrosis, which is a serious chronic condition affecting the lungs. You'll see one drug there called Kalydeco, which is about $300,000 annually per person, and a drug called Orkambi, which is $245,000 annually. So one of the significant points I want to make here is you'll see there in red under Orkambi to the right, its share of overall spend has doubled. So we are starting to see large increases in use of drugs, and at $245,000 annually, this is going to have a material impact on a plan. The next drug is a drug called Soliris. Again, Soliris is a drug that's used for or indicated for 4 different diseases, and it is considered one of the most expensive drugs in the world. It's $700,000 per person per year. You'll see there the graph or the chart to the right. As a percentage of total cost, it has actually increased dramatically from 0.02% to 0.18%. So despite these being drugs for rare diseases, we're seeing, significant increases in spend. 2 other drugs, one called Dupixent and another called Nucala. Dupixent is for a skin condition. Nucala is for severe asthma. Here, for instance, and this is in the private market, these drugs, Dupixent is about $25,000 a year. There are alternative drugs that range between $100 to $3,000 per year. So Dupixent is a quantum more expensive. And then you've got Nucala, which is about $26,000 a year. So we're seeing significant increases in the cost. Bottom line is you want to be sure that your drug plan formulary is really managing the use of these drugs. In other words, who is most appropriate to be covered. Next one is a new migraine drug called Aimovig. It is for the prevention of migraines, is what it's indicated for. You know, traditionally migraine drugs, it's about $1,000 for traditional migraine drugs, $1,000 per year. These new drugs are between $6,000 and $8,000. So again, quite a significant difference in cost for migraine drugs. And we now have a few more migraine drugs that have come on the market in this same new price range of $6,000 to $8,000. So definitely increasing the share of spend in migraines. A watch list for this year and beyond, which is essentially our gene therapies. There are 2 gene therapies there you'll see to the left, which have been launched in Canada this year. One is called Zolgensma, which is to treat a rare condition in young children. The price tag is $2.8 million. In theory, it's believed to be a one-time treatment. That said, there are already drug trials underway with respect to using the one-time gene therapy treatment with another drug on top of it. And so that is still to be determined. Another drug, or gene therapy rather, at $1 million for inherited blindness. And then you'll see there to the right, cancer, which I'm going to speak a little bit more to, is we're seeing very, very expensive cancer drugs. So also in a new range of spend. So these are both 2 gene therapies, but again, from anywhere from $226,000 to a gene therapy to treat a specific type of cancer in children that's $450,000. So in the next slide, you'll see 2 areas where we're seeing very high growth specifically, and this is cancer drugs again and diabetes drugs. So you'll see there on the left, the cancer drugs. So the compound annual growth rate increased by 8.63%. And what's important here is you'll see that top group of 3 drugs, top cancer drugs 2020, and the price tags between $30,000 and $50,000. And below that, we're now seeing the next wave of cancer drugs, anywhere from $188,000 per year to $287,000 per year. So again, we're just seeing the individual price of drugs going up quite dramatically. On the other side, diabetes, which is a fairly common condition and where there are a lot of different drugs on the marketplace. There's one drug in particular called Ozempic that hit the market and very successfully received coverage by the Ontario Drug Benefit Plan, which is sort of seen as a real win in terms of getting adoption across the province. It's putting a lot of pressure on plans. It's quite a bit more expensive. And again, we're starting to see diabetes as one of the top conditions. So Eric, you might have something to add here as well.
Yeah, I mean, I've got, when I hear Ozempic, I mean, immediately comes to mind the jingle. I in my head, I certainly won't sing it, but on top of these new drugs coming out, there's a lot more advertising of drugs, making employees, making physicians aware of these things. So you'll definitely see the diabetic drug Ozempic a fair bit when watching TV. I remember seeing it when I was watching that hockey team in Toronto. I can't remember their name right now. But just for fun, and some of my colleagues have shared with me, the way that you can tell whether a commercial is Canadian or American is by the advertising rules. In Canada, you can say the name of the drug, but can't say what it does, or you can say what it does, but not the name. And the best example I can think of was, it's quite a while ago, but the old Viagra commercials, the Good Morning commercial series, where it never really said why the man or his partner were so happy dancing around in the morning. But in the end, the Viagra brand was splashed across your screen. Now, in the US, drug companies need to allocate 50% of their airtime to the side effects of the drug. So when you hear that, them talking about a new drug that may cause side effects like skin bleeding, blindness, and hair loss, you definitely know it's a US commercial. So anyways, just something fun to share with everybody. Thanks, Helen.
Thanks. So I also want to share with you one other trend, which relates to specific age groups. So the spend on specialty drugs, and again, specialty drugs we often think of as drugs over let's say $10,000, has increased quite dramatically in young people, so people under 12. And I think this is important because those then as dependents tend to be on the plan for quite a long time. So here you'll see this is the proportion of the total spend on specialty drugs by age group. Again, for that under 12, it increased from 0.9% to 2.2%. So that is a significant increase. And when you look, for instance, on the next slide, we look now we're looking at that specialty drug spend by age. So we're just dicing it up a little bit differently. You'll see there that the 12-year-old age group saw a very large growth. So specialty of the total specialty spend among the under 12s, it increased from 8.6% to 25.9%. And then of particular note, in that 30 to 39-year-olds, which are the ones that have the circles around them or the ovals around them, they had the largest, they currently have the largest percentage spend on specialty drugs. And that increased from 29.5% to 38.2% in the last 3 years. So again, young people, we're starting to see a very large spend among young people on specialty drugs through plans, and then also in the 30 to 39-year-old group. So just a couple further thoughts. These kinds of high cost drug claims really limit the ability of plans to potentially change carriers. And so, for instance, ourselves, we're aware of a plan that spent about close to $1 million on drugs for about 400 claimants. $750,000 of the $900,000 was on specialty drugs, and $580,000 of that was for one drug for one person. So that kind of plan makes it very, and right, those obviously that for that one $580,000 drug, that would be a drug for a rare disease, but it makes very, very difficult to change carrier. In this particular case, the plan did end up changing carrier, but what happened is the carrier excluded coverage for specialty drugs. And the goal was really to try to push those claims to the public plan. So in this particular case, to the Ontario Drug Benefit Plan. That said, public plans are much more rigorous with respect to coverage for specialty drugs. In other words, it tends to be more restrictive. So in this particular case, it's quite possible that that large claim for a rare disease wouldn't get picked up by the public plan, in which case that individual no longer has coverage. So Eric, you'll likely have something to add here. It's also the end of my part of the presentation, so I'm going to hand it back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Helen. I mean, there's so much here in this space to dig into. I find it, interesting, every single time that we hear you talk, or certainly that you and I have discussions. I would like to take it back to our risk areas, but this time, let's ask a different question. Hopefully Helen has been able to increase your awareness as it relates to the drug risks of a benefit program. So now that you are aware, or at least more aware, the question is, what is your tolerance for risk? Is your organization adverse or willing to take risks? And there's no wrong answer here. It's about individual style and corporate culture. With the public healthcare policy, you should have a general idea of the provincial drug programs if you have employees across the country. Canada, as everyone knows, has universal healthcare, but not universal drug coverage. A national drug program, if it does ever happen, and that may be different, based on what Helen was talking about, could be an issue if you have unionized employees or provide benefits based on a collective agreement. On the insurance contract side, insurance carriers will continue to make changes to their insurance contracts, your contracts. They often do this unilaterally. Contracts have been changed many times often without consent. Now, they've been done so to limit newer drugs being added to programs, or allowing carriers to force a change to biosimilars from the brand name biologic. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing, but once again, could affect employers that have a collective agreement or require additional communication to a specific class of employees. In regards to stop loss and carrier mobility, health and dental benefits, it's really much of this is related to the underwriting or the way the plan is funded. So benefits can be underwritten on an insured basis. This is where you pay a premium rate and all of the risk or reward stays with the insurance company. For self-insured plans, also referred to as ASO, the company simply pays for claims plus the expenses of your program. It's basically as a pay-as-you-go plan. Or in a refund or retention accounting arrangement, it's a hybrid of the two. So if you do take away anything from my part of the presentation, is that you should be fully aware from the financial model that you use for your health and dental programs, and you really should know what your stop loss threshold or limit is. Even if you're fully insured, you may not be able to leave your provider as another insurance company may need to absorb some of the recurring drug claims. There is industry protection in place under the Extended Drug Policy Protection Program, or what's referred to as EP3, but does not work as well as it was initially intended, and it seems only to work in very catastrophic or specific circumstances. If you cannot afford the premium and cannot move from the insurance company, you and your organization may be forced to make some hard plan design choices, i.e. takeaways, which could degrade your employee brand value and make it more difficult for you to attract and retain good talent. So it's essential to know your plan's risks and your tolerance to those risks. And as an organization, you'll want to answer the question, is our current benefit strategy aligned with our risk tolerance? So where do you fit in on the spectrum? It doesn't matter to us if you're a risk taker or entirely risk adverse. We simply want, through this presentation, to move you up the risk awareness line and make you more aware of the type of stuff, that might happen. We have provided some examples of benefit plan risks. So what kind of tools and resources are you and your consulting teams employing today to manage those risks associated with your benefit plans? Some risks simply can't be transferred, eliminated, or mitigated if they were not addressed in advance of the event. A typical example is you can't buy house insurance when your house is on fire. There are many things that our team can fix after the fact, but we truly believe the best strategy is to set yourself correctly in the first place. In the end, we want to make sure that you're not in the help me part of the chart. But if you do need help, both Helen and I are here to assist. So some key takeaways from today, be informed. Awareness and understanding what's out there with partners like Helen. There is a solution to every problem. Use the tools and resources that are available to you, including the expertise of your consultants and the subject matter experts that they can bring to the table. Know your benefits insurer. Who are you dealing with? Not all insurers act or react the same way. Like people, they each have their own idiosyncrasies and handle situations differently. And they won't all offer the same types of solutions. And finally, nothing replaces good stewardship. The process of identifying risks and tolerance should be an ongoing process, not done once. This is something that should be part of your stewardship of your program, where you're continually considering future trends that may affect your risk. So to sum it all up in this presentation, we discussed types of risks, your readiness. Helen helped shine a light on the potential pitfalls within health programs to enhance your awareness. And finally, we chatted about your risk tolerance. We hope that we were able to provide you with some useful knowledge and takeaways that will help you better manage your benefits programs and the associated risks today, making you ready for tomorrow. So now we'll take a few questions. And as I mentioned earlier, if you have a question, click the Q&A button on your screen and type your question in the space provided. And if we're not able to get into all your questions today, somebody from the Hub team will follow up with you after the event. So Helen, I ask you to take yourself on mute. There's a couple of questions here that have already come through. We could probably combo on these. I see two questions here. It says, what strategies, there's two, they're very, very closely related. So I'll read both of them. What strategies can you utilize to mitigate drug costs when you have a low employee population, so a smaller group? And how do you compensate for specialty drugs? So maybe I'll kick off, Helen, you can kind of fill in with some of the gaps as well too. So as far as compensating for specialty drugs, I think leveraging the types of programs that your insurer has to offer, things like prior authorization, things like adding, I'm going to use Manulife's as an example, their Drug Watch program, including those on your programs, and then seeking consultants that have expertise or subject matter experts, or in the case of Hub, partnerships with people like the Formulary group and Helen, making sure you understand what's out there and leveraging those programs that are offered by your current insurance company today to do so. On the small side, there's other things that can be done. It's not as common, and certainly folks in the consulting space like to stay away from those, but caps on drugs, and then those drugs will get pushed to other areas. Maybe Helen can kind of talk to some of those, but being aware and clearly understanding your plan funding arrangement as well too, as I mentioned earlier, and how that relates to your ability to move carriers are all keys to essentially managing specialty drugs and then managing drug costs when you have a smaller population. So Helen, I'm going to throw it over to you maybe to kind of fill in some gaps there and see if
Sure.
there's anything that you can add
Sure.
on that side.
Just a couple of comments. So with respect to compensating for specialty drugs, just to put it into context, because we see so many drug plans and also, contribute to them. When you look at a drug plan, typically the specialty spend is, let's say 25 to 30%. One of the examples I gave was quite unusual in specialty spend being so, 85% of the plan spend. But what's important to consider is that there's also I'll call them the main formulary drugs. So drugs for common conditions well. And that's part of there's the formulary that has those drugs and then specialty drugs. It's important to be managing both. So how do you manage both? On the main formulary, it's again paying attention to the kind of formulary that's put in place, who's making the decisions with respect to which drugs are covered. And on the specialty drug side, again, it's asking questions with respect to the criteria and the criteria for coverage. Is it just open in terms of if it's approved, you can have access to that drug, or are there specific criteria that reflect how best to use specialty drugs? So that's one on the one side. And on the other side, I think on the low employee population, and we sort of see all spectrums as Eric, you would as well. And I think one of the aspects there again is, I keep drawing it back to the formulary, because the formulary is one of the things where you could have the biggest impact in terms of managing spend, and also, quite frankly, giving access to good advice, so to speak.
Well, and how do you feel about caps on plans? So if like say, we often see where the smaller employers, just because of budgeting and cost, need to put a cap on the plan. Now that can be either within or around the same threshold as the pooling limit, but just in general, what are your thoughts around caps within a program?
Yeah, my thought around it is again, I'm going to be a bit of a broken record in terms of get your formulary in order first, right? I'm going to guess that the majority of people on the call may not necessarily, you may not even know what a formulary is, but don't necessarily know what's covered. So as a first step, ask questions about what kind of formulary, get that in order first. Caps, while not ideal, I certainly understand as a small employer myself, while they're used, what that can do is at least then coordinate with what provincial coverage might be available. So again, here in Ontario, there could be coordination with the Trillium drug program for employees that are on high cost drugs, for instance. And again, by having the formulary in order, then you might be able to coordinate quite well with that Trillium program. And so in that case, the cap is really protecting you, but there's still an avenue for access to pay for the balance, cover the balance of the drug.
And Helen, there's some programs where you can combine with the actual drug manufacturer where they provide some support to individual situations, correct?
That's right. So those are called patient support programs or patient assistance programs. And so on that note, just one quick comment, I'd say something that I understand, some employers, choose to cover or reimburse at 100%. But just on that note, if you reimburse all drugs at 100% and especially the specialty drugs, you're now eliminating any opportunity to coordinate with those patient support programs. So I think, again, and this is something that your advisors can certainly weigh in on, but I think there's lots of dynamics there in a drug plan, and it is getting more, let's say, complex given this increasing cost and spend on specialty.
And Helen, that's at all sizes. So the complexity is there not only in large employers, but small employers. Just because, you may say you've got, between, let's say 5 and 200 people, doesn't mean there isn't a layer of complexity. You can go down, look at the formulary, look at the lists, look at the caps, engage with the insurance company, or have your advisor engage with the insurance company, whatever you feel most comfortable for. But don't believe that it's just the way it is, that the way it's laid out from the insurance company, there isn't more that it can be done or be added to that program. So I think that, sorry, go ahead, Ellen, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, absolutely, Eric. And again, that formulary is so key to it, and asking the right, what kind of formulary you have, et cetera. I'd also say, I'd encourage people not to shy away from introducing a formulary that is managing based on evidence, because really what it's about there is really just good employee communication. And I mean, I can certainly, share quite a lot of experience we have with respect to good member impact and member engagement.
Cool. So I see three more here, Helen. I think we'll maybe get to two. One's directed, I think, specifically to me. One's directed to you. I'll take the first one. I'll read it out loud. So it's, you mentioned what a typical stop loss pooling limit threshold would be for a smaller organization. I think they're referring to the $10,000 or $15,000 I spoke to. What are larger organizations doing in our experience? Okay, so this is, very interesting topic. A couple of years ago, the limits for a large organization, I'm going to classify large as really above 500 or maybe even above 700 employees. Often seeing lower thresholds. $20,000 was kind of the standard. What happened is the insurance companies, at least we understand from them, that this was not something that was being well managed internally. They were losing quite a bit of money within their pools. We mentioned earlier about, the drugs over a certain limit being looked after by the insurance company or being absorbed by the insurance company. That is the pool that I'm referring to. So quite a few of them caught on to this and realizing that this wasn't, financially viable for them, and really started to put some very large premiums around this risk element of the healthcare program. So the premiums for that coverage were becoming very astronomical. In fact, they were almost forcing clients to move to higher thresholds. Oftentimes, it didn't even make sense. We do with clients a kind of cost benefit analysis. I'm going to take on this amount of claims, but still have some pooling protection or stop loss protection above a certain level. It really should be looked at as pure insurance. So the clients that I was working with, we were moving them to higher levels. I would say the more appropriate level for a group that's probably in that larger size band today is probably going to be about 50,000. That keeps the premium at a lower level, means that the program is going to take on more of the claims costs, but also gives you protection for those high catastrophic items. So that's what we've seen. Very high premiums have forced clients to move to higher pooling thresholds, take on additional claims risk that the insurance company typically would have put on. So that's what we've seen. But in not just moving them to a higher threshold, also taking a look at formulary, also taking a look at features like pre-authorization, ensuring that provincial programs are being leveraged. So it's not just one thing. There's a myriad of things that need to get done. So that detail on the drug program really needs to be looked at and making sure that it's tight holistically, not just sort of in one area. So that's what I'm seeing on the larger employers doing. And that's kind of what I'd say would be standard for a pooling threshold at this point. Okay, Helen, the next one is definitely directed at you. It's not something I would be able to answer very confidently. How would you characterize the pharma environment in Canada from a business perspective? As a country, do we have favorable or unfavorable business environment for drug companies? And then maybe two aspects. There may be generic and there may be brand. Maybe you can comment on that.
Sure. So I'll just sort of quickly take you back when I was in government leading big reforms. There was a lot of, back then, a lot of discussion with respect to pharma investment in the province and I guess more broadly in the country, and really a discussion around, should that investment be reflected in drug prices? And certainly it was our recommendation that it shouldn't be reflected in drug prices, but it should be reflected in the province's sort of economic agenda. Back then, it was still, I'd say, a pretty favorable environment. Fast forward to today, I would say it is the regulations, for instance, the PMPRB regulations, also the, let's say, process, the different organizations that are reviewing drug, for instance. So we've got a big national organization called CADA that reviews for public plans, the dynamic that then they have to go in and be negotiated as well. I think it is creating some real tension among pharma. I'd say that the PMPR regulations that are to be implemented on July 1st now, they've been delayed a few times. Those are probably are the biggest issue right now in creating the most tension. So, the biggest implication for pharma would be the reporting requirements. And I'd say, in my review, that sort of C environment really is creating an unfavorable business environment. And whereas back again, when I was leading reforms, we had threats all the time about them not bringing drugs to market. They didn't feel that credible necessarily at the time. I now actually, I think that those kinds of comments, that companies may legitimately not be as quick to bring drugs to market in Canada, so less favorable.
You're on a roll. There's a question here from our friend Bar Martinez. How will PMPRB pricing reforms impact employer-sponsored drug plans? And do you think they will actually go ahead July 1st?
Yeah, and just Barb, it's a great question. I think that's a bit of a crystal ball, isn't it? I mean, they've been delayed so many times. I am hopeful that they're delayed again, just because I think it's a sort of a fabulous amount of fabulously complex amount of reporting that's going to have to be done. And, you know, arguably, I mean, I think it is a fact that are these regulations among our governments, you know, the bureaucracy in terms of getting drugs approved did have an impact on our ability to negotiate supply of vaccines. I think it did very directly have an impact on that. Will they impact employer-sponsored plans? One of the, again, complications is with respect to the reporting and how that reporting will be reflected into pricing. Back, I will say, when I was managing the big Ontario plan, I know that we in Ontario received rebates back from the PMPRB. The private plans never received, I don't believe ever received a single penny. So I'm not necessarily, I think I'm not necessarily optimistic that employer-sponsored plans are going to see, you know, large decreases in pricing just yet. It's a complex matter, I will say.
Great. There's one here. I'll give you a break, and then there's one coming back to you right after, Helen. So it says, we heard you both raise concerns about care and mobility, and this one's directed at Hub. How can Hub help us navigate this if we're already seeing big increases? I think we somewhat kind of addressed that, digging into the detail. Each story, each situation is going to be unique. Finding out what those drugs are that are on the program that are being taken. What's the detail around those? Are they going to be recurring? Is it a one-time, one-time issue? And really getting into that detail. If it was coming to our team and we needed support, we would certainly reach out to Helen and the group for some guidance and direction, and then work in a collaborative way with the carrier to find out how we can pivot around some of those things. So it's kind of, there's lots kind of in that question, really, again, digging into the deep detail on the situation itself, and then providing the appropriate guidance, and then bringing in the right subject matter experts at the same time. So hopefully that somewhat answers that question that's there. Next question for Helen. There seems to be plans getting traction now that they basically omit large cost drugs. The providers of these plans say they will get funding elsewhere. Oops, sorry, it's moving here for me. The providers of these plans say they will get funding elsewhere or ultimately push to Trillium. These plans really don't provide guarantees, but basically they pitch on past situations. So Helen, I'll read it for you one more time. There seems to be plans getting traction now that basically omit large cost drugs or high cost drugs. The providers of these plans say they will get funding elsewhere or ultimately push it to Trillium. These plans don't really provide guarantees, but there's a pitch on past situations.
Yeah, so I think the key is the comment around they don't provide guarantees and they can't. One of the concerns is, I know sort of firsthand with the Trillium program, for instance, so if as a plan you decide to omit large cost drugs and your employee goes to Trillium and is declined, you cannot now pick up the cost of that drug. You would be offside with the law. And so I think that's a really important consideration for considering that, because essentially you need to be sure that if you don't cover them and you push, encourage people to apply through patient support programs or Trillium, you can't now just pick up that claim if they're denied. So really important, it'd be offside with the legislation. And so it's really then, I guess, a sort of, in our topic today, it's really, what's your risk tolerance for that? Certainly, I mean, I'm not, an insurance specialist. I'm more on the drug side, but, I certainly hear, I've had, heard advisors comment around, well, in really a drug plan is really about, shouldn't it really be about the sort of risk related to or insurance related to these larger cost claims rather than, antibiotics that are sort of $5 a script. And so that's maybe more of a philosophical thought around how drug plans, what the focus should be. So beware is my bottom line about these strategies.
Thanks, Helen. This one I can't answer. I'm not sure if you can, but can you comment on the employer's legal liability if they are challenged about a drug that was declined based on formulary manager's decision making? Being a formulary manager yourself, Helen, I think this is probably something you want to address.
Yeah, and I will say, when I was in the Ontario government, we were essentially a formulary manager as well. So I will just sort of quickly differentiate between two concepts. One concept is around access to a drug. So the drug is approved in Canada and you can buy it. The other is who's going to pay for it. So access and funding. With respect to who's going to pay for it, that's where the formulary comes in. And so any drug that has a notice of compliance, so approval for sale, I'm going to say just about any drug, every Canadian has access to that drug. Who's going to cover it, right, is really then the formulary management side of it. And that is specific to, we're going to pay 80% of it or 90% or 100%, or we're not going to cover it. What's important really, I would say around I can't speak specifically to individual employers' legal liability, but from someone who managed a $5 billion drug plan and formulary, the fact that we didn't cover a drug, we didn't have legal liability, right? People need to have access to drugs that are approved, but the funding is a decision made by the plan or the formulary management.
So Helen, does the employer have any legal liability? Could somebody, I guess people could sue for anything they wanted to, but could somebody sue the employer? Does the employer have anything, as you've seen in your experience, both through the government and through your own business?
Yeah. So again, I can't provide advice, but legal advice. But in our experience, the answer is no, because the individual still has access to it. It's just they're going to have to pay out of pocket.
Right. And as the last question that we have, and we're coming up on time anyways. Oh, there's another one that just popped through. So is cost plus worth exploring in certain situations? Yes, I would say depending on the situation, cost plus could be an option if it's something that you're not looking at offering to the broader employee population. Let's say you have a cap or a limitation on anything. Cost plus would be something to pursue. I'm not personally a fan of it if you're not going to offer those things to the same grouping. I do like benefits being applied on a fair and equitable basis. That's more sort of best practice and experience. But depending on the situation, there's not much here more as far as the question is concerned. Cost plus is always something that could be looked at, or potentially having more flexibility within your current program by changing your funding methodology to, let's say, self-funded. If you're small, probably not very practical, but if you're mid to large, going with a self-funded program or something even in between might be an option for you to give you more planned flexibility to have things paid for the program at your desire. So, and I think we've got one last one, Helen, and then we'll wrap right up. If an employee was declined by the Trillium program, then the employer can submit cost plus claim for the specialty drug. Then how will the employee be dealing with the huge burden? Any advice? So if the employee was declined by Trillium, and then the employer, I guess, can't submit to cost plus per the specialty drug, then how will the employee be dealing with the huge burden? Any advice? Anything that you can think of, Helen?
Yeah, I mean, my advice would be to look into whether there's a patient support program for that drug. There are quite a lot of patient support programs for specialty drugs, so that would really be the avenue to pursue. I mean, those programs also would have criteria with respect to eligibility, et cetera, but I think that's really probably the where you would want to go.
And Elena, we've had my team personally has had some recent discussions with various drug companies, and they've certainly made themselves available if we have questions, of course, to their drugs that they sort of produce and sell themselves. But we do have some open dialogue with those. So either if you're a hub client, reach out to your consultant and they can get in touch with somebody like myself, or certainly reach out to me. We can provide some support there, or at least some guidance. Anyways, thank you for all the questions. I think we've come to the end of our time today, and following the webinar, the survey will appear for all of you to complete, and we appreciate all the feedback you can provide. We'll also receive an email with a link to the recording that you can share out with your colleagues and those sorts of things. And we certainly know that your time is valuable. On behalf of Helen and myself, I'd like to thank you for taking your time out of your busy day to participate in this webinar. And as I said earlier, I also want to thank the Hub internal folks for helping put this on. I've been very supportive over the last week or so. So thanks so much. Thanks, Helen.
Thank you.